I was living outside of Toronto. I'd been a stand-up comic and an actor since 2009. I had lived in Toronto, and I was in a relationship that moved out of Toronto, and I was living in Guelph. That relationship, we ended up going separate ways. So it was kind of at a time in my life where I was moving back into Toronto and really trying to figure out who I was and where I fit in, not only as an actor, but just as a person in the world, which I'm sure anyone can relate who's been in a relationship. Sometimes after a relationship, there's a little bit of identity crisis where you're like, okay, well, now who am I? Where am I? Where do I go? So I was looking to sort of re-plug myself into the Toronto arts community. And also I was looking for a home. I didn't know where to live. So I was sort of in transition. And a good friend of mine, you've heard him, you heard his name probably brought up several times here on the podcast throughout. And there's an episode with him featured in it, an early episode, probably like episode 5 or 6. Trevor Ketchison literally lives across the street. And I had a week where when I wasn't living in Toronto, I had back auditions. 4 days in a row, I had auditions, and I didn't want to commute. I didn't have a place here in Toronto yet. And Trevor was great enough to let me just basically flop on his couch. And we were running scenes, like he would run lines with me for my auditions. He's also an actor as well and a filmmaker. So I was helping him with his. And sort of the idea of community started to be like, oh, this is way easier when you have another actor to run this stuff with. Also, I just sort of became aware of this neighborhood in Queen East and Riverside as the studio district. And from his place, I was literally walking 10 or 15 minutes to all of my auditions because Jigsaw, Lisa Parison, Milestone, Larissa Mayer, a bunch of the casting directors, they're all in this neighborhood. So it sort of started to occur to me like, okay, this is the neighborhood I need to be in. At the time, though, I was in between work and I hadn't booked anything too recently, so I didn't have a ton of cash. So I was also concerned about affording a Toronto place. And I didn't want roommates. I was old enough where I'm like, I can't have roommates. I'm not going to go from a relationship where we had a house and all that to living in. I didn't want to live in a basement apartment, and I didn't want to have roommates. So I was sort of trying to be creative and figure out, how do I make this work? And so the idea of finding a work-live commercial space that I could use as a studio space and potentially either rent it out or provide services out of the studio really early on, just to make ends meet. It was like, I don't want to be homeless, and I want to have a cool spot. And I knew I couldn't afford a condo and a studio space. So I made the decision really early on. It was kind of a no-brainer, where it was like, okay, I need this work-live studio space. I'll give up a little bit of the luxury and the niceties of having a nice home in order to have a studio space, knowing that sooner or later having the studio will afford me all the luxuries that I need in my life, including one day a silent yacht, the 62-footer. But I knew if I didn't have the studio space in the first place, a lot of that stuff wouldn't come true. So over the course of literally a week, I scrambled together first month, last month, deposit, registered a business, bought the domain name for Laughing Vikings, and was able to get this space. And this was all February 2017. So we're coming up on, I guess it'd be 5 years this coming February. So it was all like, it was really out of necessity, but still with a bit of a vision. And then it evolved. At first it was me and a handful of friends who I sort of started blasting it out there. I have the studio space. I didn't really know what it was going to be, but I was pitching it as, if you have a podcast or if you need YouTube videos and green screen videos. A friend of mine who was on the podcast last week in episode 49, Mandy Mae Cheatham, she was very well connected in the acting community and auditioning a lot. And she sort of nudged me, gave me a nudge and said, hey, what actors need is a space to shoot auditions, self-tape auditions. And this was before pandemic. There was still a lot of self-tapes then. Now it's all self-tape. So it was very visionary and prophetic of her to lean me in that direction. So very quickly, it was twofold. It became a podcast studio was what a lot of it was in the beginning. Mark DeBonis, who's a fantastic stand-up comic, he had a podcast network called the 10-Minute Podcast Network, where like there was probably he had dozens of other comedians on his network producing their podcast, but rather than have a studio in their basement where they got to invite people to their home, it was nice to have a public space that was easily accessible. So early on, we were doing a ton of podcasting here and a ton of self tapes. And then it just sort of grew and grew and grew and grew from there. And something that I want to share with you, one sec, I'll be right back. I found this is my notepad from that year. And I highly suggest if you don't have a notepad or a journal or something where you're keeping track of things, it's amazing for your life in the present as you're using it. But it's also amazing as a retrospective thing to look back and be like, oh shit, who was I 5 years ago? And what was I dealing with? This notepad literally has the first time I ever wrote the words Laughing Vikings in it. And hilariously, I was like, okay, what could the name be? And I was thinking like, what are we? We're a production company. We're going to be on social media, a little bit of marketing. So I didn't really know what it was, but the first two things I wrote down as business names, and think of this now in terms of a pandemic, was Viral Viking and Virus Viking. Those were the first two, like, and I was thinking in terms of viral videos. But now I think, like, imagine I chose the term Viral Viking and now I had that in the middle of a pandemic. That's either a great or a horrible name for a pandemic. And then down the page, I don't know if you can see this, down the page by the bottom, I have Viking Studios and then Laughing Viking Studios, which came from the fact that on my dad's side, we're of Danish heritage. His father, my grandfather on my dad's side was born in Denmark, and I'm a stand-up comic and I love comedy. So it was like, instead of the horrific raping and pillaging Vikings, in my head, I'm like, rather than extend that kind of legacy, I want to change the legacy of Vikings into Laughing Vikings, the kind of Vikings that they take over your area, but with laughter, not with burning all your houses down and stealing all your stuff. So that was the beginning. That was 2017. And I also want to point out, I had no business starting a business. I never went to business school. I don't have a background in that. I had some corporate background, but that was in a multi-million-dollar business that was already set up. So I was a manager, a corporate manager with a financial services company. So I had a little sense of management and leadership and kind of how things might run, but no business background. And I think about it, that February, there's a few times in my life where I've gone all chips in, like where I literally took all my chips on a poker table when it was like, I'm all in. One of them was switching from the corporate career into stand-up. That was on a 180 on a dime, basically quitting a corporate career and instantly throwing myself into stand-up and acting. And then that was 2009. The second time was 2017. There was all of my money. My first month, last month, and deposit was all the money I had in the bank account. And it wasn't a ton of money. It was like, maybe it was $6,000 or $5,000. It was less. It was probably $5,000 at the time. Our rent was cheaper. But also some credit card. I think part of my deposit, I think I took cash advance off a credit card in order to have enough money to cover all that. And I think that was a huge moment for me to have the trust in myself and the I don't know what you'd call it, the courage, I guess is what you'd call it, to just be like, okay, I believe in myself. This is the direction I want to go. What does it take? It's going to take all of my money to do it. And so I would not that I would encourage anyone to put themselves at risk or put their family at risk if you have a family financially, but so far it's worked out for me. And if I didn't make that leap, we wouldn't be here today.